Okay, hi, my name is Matthew Gusdile, and I'm here to present the work of a lot of people, including myself, entitled Tabletop Roleplaying Games as Procedural Content Generation. This is work from myself, Debbie, Max, Mike, Miriam, Antonios, and Anne. That's right, we've got 4 M's, 2 A's, and a D. Pretty darn good, I think. Now, what the heck is this about? Well, we're going to be talking about tabletop role-playing games. If you're not at all familiar, if I'm saying these words and that means nothing to you, high level, you've got a group of people. They're going to be working together to tell a story in which they are role-playing as characters, distinct from themselves. Basic idea. The tabletop bit means that you're generally playing on a tabletop, either a physical one or, especially these days, a virtual one. Now, if I say tabletop role-playing games, that may sound unfamiliar, but a thing you've almost definitely heard about is Dungeons & Dragons. Dungeons & Dragons is an example of a tabletop role-playing game, but despite what you might have heard, it is not the only example of a tabletop role-playing game. For example, you have things like Honey Heist, which is a game in which you play as a group of bear criminals on a heist for some honey at a honey convention. Or games like Mutants in the Night, worked by Orion Black, who is inspired by X-Men. Should note, Honey Heist was written by Grant Howitt. So, huge variance. And tabletop role-playing games are gaining increasing attention in terms of things like graphic novels, such as The Adventure Zone, animated series, such as Harmon Quest, and, of course, fast food advertising deals, as with Critical Role playing a Wendy's tabletop role-playing game. And you also have merchandise, like pins, puzzles, and, of course, shirts. I should note, I'm wearing a Friends at the Table actual play, which is a tabletop group that does a podcast. I'm wearing one of their shirts right now, so I'm very clearly biased. I very clearly think that this is an interesting area to be working on. But you may not be, and you might be asking yourself, well, why should me, a PCG researcher, care about this thing? Well, here's our thesis. Tabletop role-playing games can be understood as an example of PCG. And they are an underexplored application domain for PCG. So, quick introduction to tabletop role-playing games, because you're going to need a little bit of a better idea of what these things are before we can move forward. So, in the moment-to-moment, a tabletop role-playing game tends to look like conversations between people or narration by a specific person. Now, often you're going to have some kind of thing on your tabletop, for example, a like battle map or game map, which has different icons indicating different characters, different items, and a whole background for the space that you're in. Now, these things together can go on for quite some time, where you're just having a conversation, just talking, just narrating events, until you hit a conflict point, or a point where you need some resolution. At that point, you tend to rely on dice, though not always. So sometimes there's conflict resolution mechanics that use playing cards, or that ask you to have even more interesting ways of resolving conflict. Look outside at the moon, things like that. Now, this random noise, this whatever it is going to be interpreted by the game's mechanics. So by rolling a certain number of die, I could, for example, figure out, according to the game's mechanic, whether or not I hit a goblin. And then that is translated into more dialogue, more narration, etc. That's what the moment-to-moment is like. Now, over a session, there's going to occur, which is sort of a longer period, like a few hours where you're playing a tabletop role-playing game. This is going to repeat many, many, many times. Often it is going to be guided by one player in particular who often has a role called Game Master or Dungeon Master. This role is sort of like a director for the story, but you're not the sole sort of owner of the story being produced or the experience being produced. Instead, you could actually have a GM-less game, or you can have a game which is being run on a module, which is sort of this pre-authored thing that says, hey, here's the kinds of challenges you're going to face, sort of giving you prompts to keep going forward from there. Okay, so let's jump back to this thesis. And I'm going to focus on this first part especially. Tabletop RPGs can be understood as an example of PCG. So let's think about this for a second. Let's imagine tabletop role-playing games under a PCG lens. What does that mean? Well, I've already introduced this sort of like pipeline or this process of random noise translated by mechanics and then translated by people into events. But this is broader, right? So we can think about a particular group playing, for example, D&D or a particular game. Sorry. We can think about a particular group playing a game, so mechanics and some random noise, and producing a narrative, right? Over a period of time, these sort of events are going to string together and form a narrative. But this is not just one kind of narrative that can be produced. So while you might think about tabletop role-playing games and immediately say, okay, well, you're going to be playing Dungeons & Dragons, and you're going to make a story like Lord of the Rings. A lot of the time, if you talk to somebody who's played Dungeons & Dragons, you're going to find that actually the output stories are something more like Shrek. Or, as is often the case, you'll end up with a group that takes Dungeons & Dragons and decides to play a game in a completely different setting, like Firefly, for example. An old TV show, which is sort of a combination of like Old West and space sort of settings. Now, at this point, you might suggest, okay, you should be playing a different game, and there's lots of different games, and they produce different things, and they can even go beyond narrative. So, for example, The Quiet Year by Avery Adler produces both a map of the town, the village you create while playing the game, like an actual map you can look at, plus the story of that village, is sort of looking over time in a final year until it is attacked by some outside force. Highly recommended. Instead, you don't actually need to produce a story at all. So in Oh No, Bro, You Thought Too Hard About the Bangers, Bro, he specifically warned you not to do that, and now you fell into the banger singularity, bro. Almost said that completely right without it messing it up. We have from Taylor LaBreche, I should note, this game just sees you role-playing to produce a playlist, a music playlist, a playlist of songs, with no notion of creating a narrative. In fact, Taylor specifically rejects this notion of you have to produce a narrative from your games. Now, there's this other interesting thing you can do here, because it's not just this one process, but you can hook these processes into other things. So, for example, we could take our map and our story that we got from Quiet Year and plug that into the experience of playing a different game to produce another story. And this is exactly what the Actual Play podcast, Friends at the Table, did with their Marielda season, in which they used The Quiet Year to create a town named Marielda, and then they played John Harper's Blades in the Dark in that town. And this reminded us of PCG pipelines, the idea of putting together different generators, in this case, some of them games, some of them random number generators, and some of them people, in order to produce a final output. Now, this is a paper, in this case, a figure that I took from a recent Rosine to Julia's paper. Now, in terms of that second bit, the underexplored application domain for PCG, this one is a little self-evident. Now, there is some work, for example, Horswell et al. On generating play sets for the game Fiasco, or some recent work from Ferreira et al. On computer-generated music for tabletop role-playing games. There's really not a lot there. But that's okay. But that's okay, because we think that you and the rest of us can fill in that gap, and that relative unexploredness is really exciting. So for the rest of this this presentation, whatever I can fit in, I want to go over just a couple examples of cases that are particularly interesting about the intersection of PCG and tabletop role-playing games. So for example, Possibility Space is known to PCG people. It's the idea of the entirety of the output of the generator, right? And controllability, similarly, is about how can we control that output. The safety tools probably isn't a term you've heard of before. So as an example of this, we have things like the X card from John Stavropoulos. And the idea here is that with the X card, you're sitting around at a table playing a game, and you can put down the X card and say, no, that didn't happen. Whatever just happened, it didn't. And this is a way of avoiding things at the table like trauma or just tropes that are just overused. But what it really accomplishes is a way of shaping the output of the generator as it's going. How often in PCG, a grammar-based generator, do we say, oh, that last step of the grammar, don't do that, go back and do another one? Relatively infrequently, I think. But I think there's a lot of possibility there. Similarly, there's a notion of lines and veals from Ron Edwards. The idea of a line is it's a line that you're not going to cross. It's sort of like a way of adding like a constraint in like a constraint-based generator of saying, if we have this in the game, it would be invalid output of our game. A veal then is a way of saying, sort of like a soft constraint. It's saying, okay, this can be in the game, but if it's in the game, we're sort of going to fade to black. So for example, you might say we're going to have a veal on sexual content. I'm totally fine with it happening, but it's going to be off screen. You're sort of going to have the camera pan away during a romantic evening or something like that. And this is an interesting notion because, again, it's like a soft constraint. It's an idea of we're going to shape the output of our generator by saying this is going to exist, but it's not actually going to be part of the output we're all looking at. It's just going to be understood, which is not a thing that we're familiar with, at least in classic PCG or in the field of PCG broadly. Now we have a term here called the fruitful void, which might be a little bit novel to a number of people listening. This actually comes from the tabletop role-playing game designer D. Vincent Baker. And the idea is that when you're designing a tabletop role-playing game, you want to have all of your mechanics, everything that's systematized, be sort of rotating around or centered around a primary theme that isn't systematized. That's the fruitful void. So, for example, in My Life with Master, which is a game by Paul Shegg, and the idea is that you are playing as like the hench person of an evil master or mistress. Now, in this game, the idea of defiance, of defying your master or mistress, is not systematized. There are no mechanics around when you defy your master or your mistress. But instead, you have things like fear and hopelessness, which are meant to push you towards defiance, but allow you to discover it on your own. This is similar to the notion of Kate Compton's imagination playgrounds of sort of fruitful voids that we leave in generators to let people fill them in. And in her case, she was mentioning for Twitter bots. But we think that this is broadly something of interest. And when you're making a PC generator, right, how do you enforce that you don't want to output certain things to leave it up to the player? Or how, when you're designing your PCG generator, do you just avoid even systematizing certain things because you don't want to tell the player it, you want to leave it up to them to figure it out. Okay, so that's about all the time. Okay, so that's about all that I have time for, unfortunately. There's so much good stuff in this paper. I really recommend checking it out if I've at all interest you. And if I have interest you, hopefully at this point you're asking, okay, well, what do I do next? You've sold me. Tabletop role-playing games are great, right? Well, there's a few obvious areas of future work that we think are interesting. So, for example, things like getting transcripts of people playing these games, something that we could parse and then do more things with, machine learning, data science, etc. Tabletop role-playing game player modeling, right? What if we could model the players of the game as we're going and adapt to their needs? Things like, well, most games use what we'd think of as like a stochastic or probabilistic grammar, right? If this die number is above this, then this happens. But what if instead you used another very common form of PCG, a GA, a genetic algorithm, or evolutionary search as the primary mechanic of your tabletop role-playing game? We think that could be quite interesting. And then, of course, there's tons of places you could put an AI in terms of the PCG pipeline, right? AI for generating events or characters, or even an AI player. Lots of cool stuff you could do there. Finally, 3 big last takeaways. Tabletop role-playing design is PCG design. That means that we can study it as an example of PCG design. Tabletop's role-playing games are a great venue for PCG work. and please read the paper. And so finally, thank you so much. From all of us to you, thank you.